The words fell from Marcus Johnson's lips like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that spread across the Family Feud studio until every person present felt the weight of what he had just revealed. Steve Harvey stood motionless at his podium, staring at this 35-year-old man whose carefully controlled exterior couldn't hide the battle still raging within him. "I came back from the war, but my soul stayed there," Marcus had said, his voice steady but carrying the hollowness of someone who had learned to function while feeling fundamentally broken. "Every day I wake up and pretend to be the man my family remembers, but that man died in Afghanistan 6 years ago." The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable pause between game show questions. It was the heavy, respectful quiet that settles when everyone in a room suddenly understands they're witnessing something that transcends entertainment, something that forces them to confront the hidden cost of freedom that many prefer not to think about. Steve looked at Marcus, sitting ramrod straight in the front row next to his wife Sarah and their 2 young children, and saw something that broke every rule of game show hosting. This wasn't about Family Feud anymore. This was about a man who had served his country with honor and came home to discover that the real war was just beginning. Let me take you back to how we arrived at this moment. What started as a routine Family Feud taping became a masterclass in invisible wounds, hidden battles, and what it means to truly come home from war. It was a gray November morning at the Steve Harvey Studios in Atlanta, just days before Veterans Day. The timing wasn't coincidental. This was a special Veterans Appreciation episode designed to honor military families and those who had served. But sitting in the front row was a family whose presence represented something much more complex than patriotic celebration. Marcus Johnson, 35 years old, and carrying himself with the perfect posture that never quite leaves a soldier, sat between his wife Sarah and their children, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Tyler. At first glance, Marcus looked like the ideal veteran success story, well-dressed, composed, surrounded by a loving family. But those who knew what to look for could see the signs. The way his eyes constantly scanned the room, the controlled breathing, the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested someone always ready for danger that might never come. Marcus had served 3 tours in Afghanistan between 2012 and 2018, most recently as a staff sergeant in the Army Rangers. He'd been decorated for valor, had saved lives, had done everything his country had asked of him. On paper, Marcus Johnson was a hero. In his own mind, he was a broken man, pretending to be whole for the sake of a family that deserved better than what war had left behind. The transition home had been brutal in ways that no one talks about. Marcus had returned to a world that expected him to simply resume being the husband and father he'd been before deployment. But war changes a person in ways that can't be undone. The hypervigilance that kept him alive in combat made peaceful sleep impossible at home. The split-second decision-making that saved his unit made ordinary civilian choices feel overwhelming. The brotherhood forged in life-or-death situations made civilian relationships feel shallow and meaningless. Sarah had tried everything to reach her husband. She'd researched PTSD, attended support groups for military spouses, encouraged Marcus to seek help. But Marcus, like many veterans, had been trained to push through pain, to never show weakness, to protect others at the cost of himself. Asking for help felt like failure, like letting down not just his family, but every soldier who hadn't made it home. The Family Feud opportunity had come through a veterans organization that had nominated the Johnson family, recognizing Sarah's tireless advocacy for military families and Marcus's service record. Sarah had hoped that a fun, normal family activity might help Marcus reconnect with the life he'd been struggling to rejoin. During the pre-show meet and greet, when Steve approached the Johnson family, he immediately noticed something different about Marcus. While other families chatted excitedly about being on television, Marcus was alert, but distant, polite, but guarded in a way that suggested someone who had learned to assess every situation for potential threats. "Marcus," Steve had said, noting the man's military bearing, "thank you for your service." "Where did you serve?" "Afghanistan, sir. 3 tours with the Rangers." Marcus had replied with the clipped precision of someone accustomed to military communication. Steve had sensed something in Marcus's tone, a weight behind his words, but the conversation had been brief, interrupted by production needs. The Johnson family had been selected to compete against the Williams family from Texas, and from the moment the game started, it was clear that Marcus was struggling with more than typical stage nerves. While his family played with enthusiasm, Marcus participated mechanically. His responses correct, but lacking the joy that usually characterized Family Feud contestants. Steve, who had been hosting long enough to read people's stories in their expressions, noticed that Marcus seemed to be fighting an internal battle. His answers were precise, his demeanor controlled, but there was something in his eyes that suggested a man who was working very hard to stay present in a moment when his mind wanted to be anywhere else. The game progressed through 3 rounds, with both families playing well. Steve was in his element, making jokes, working the crowd, creating those moments of connection that made Family Feud more than just a game show. But throughout the taping, he found himself repeatedly checking on Marcus. Something about the veteran's carefully controlled composure drawing his concern. It was during the 4th round that everything changed. The survey question seemed innocent enough. Name something that's hard to leave behind. Sarah Johnson had just given a solid answer: your hometown. As the family celebrated the points earned, Steve decided to engage more personally with the audience. That's a great answer, Steve said. Sometimes, the hardest thing about moving forward is letting go of where you've been. Marcus, as someone who's traveled the world in service to our country, what's been hard for you to leave behind? The question was meant to be inclusive, honoring, the kind of interaction that made veterans feel appreciated on this special episode. But when Marcus looked up at Steve, his expression wasn't that of someone preparing to share a heartwarming story about missing home. Mr. Harvey, Marcus said, his voice clear, but carrying a weight that made the studio begin to quiet. May I be honest with you? Steve nodded, sensing that whatever Marcus wanted to share was important. I never really left Afghanistan, Marcus said, his military training keeping his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. I came back from the war, but my soul stayed there. My body is here with my family, but part of me is still in that desert, still fighting a war that's supposed to be over. The studio began to fall silent as people sensed that something significant was happening. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger, but also more vulnerable. Every night, I go to sleep, and I'm back there. Every loud noise makes me think we're under attack. Every crowded place makes me scan for exits and threats. I look at my beautiful children and my amazing wife, and I know they deserve the man who left for war. But that man didn't come home. Steve felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that this conversation had moved far beyond entertainment into territory that demanded his full attention and respect. Marcus, Steve said, his voice gentler now. What do you mean when you say that man didn't come home? Marcus looked at his family, then back at Steve. The man who left for Afghanistan believed in heroes and villains, in clear missions and defined enemies. He believed that protecting people was simple, that courage was enough, that doing the right thing would always lead to the right outcome. He paused, his controlled facade beginning to crack slightly. The man who came back knows that good people die for no reason, that children get caught in crossfire, that sometimes you have to make choices where every option leads to someone getting hurt. That man has seen things that changed him in ways that can't be unchanged. The audience was completely silent now, drawn into Marcus's story, not by entertainment value, but by the raw honesty of someone sharing truths that many veterans live with, but rarely speak aloud. I wake up every day and try to be the husband Sarah, married and the father my children deserve, Marcus continued. But I feel like I'm acting, like I'm playing the role of someone I used to be in my family. They're so patient, so understanding, but I can see in their eyes that they're waiting for me to come back. And I don't know how to tell them that I don't think I can. Steve Harvey, who had made America laugh for decades, who had built a career on connection and joy, found himself facing something that broke every rule of game show hosting. This wasn't about Family Feud anymore. This was about a man who had given everything for his country and was struggling to find his way back to himself. Steve set down his cards and walked directly toward Marcus, abandoning the game entirely. When he reached the family, he addressed Marcus with the respect that his service demanded and the compassion that his pain required. Marcus, Steve said, First, I want to thank you not just for your service to our country, but for your honesty right now. What you just shared takes more courage than most people will ever have to show. He knelt down, so he was closer to Marcus's eye level. But I want you to listen to me very carefully. You're not broken, son. You're changed. And there's a difference. Marcus's composure finally began to crack, tears starting to form in his eyes. The man who went to Afghanistan was a good man, Steve continued. But the man who came back isn't less than that man. He's a man who has seen darkness and survived it. He's a man who has faced impossible choices and carried the weight of them. He's a man who loved his country and his family enough to put himself in harm's way. Steve looked at Sarah and the children, then back at Marcus. Your family isn't waiting for the old Marcus to come back. They're waiting for this Marcus to come home to himself. They're waiting for you to understand that you don't have to carry this alone. He stood up and addressed the entire studio, his voice carrying an authority that transcended entertainment. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, Marcus Johnson just shared something with us that thousands of veterans live with every day. Post-traumatic stress isn't a weakness. It's not a failure. It's what happens when good people are exposed to things that human beings aren't designed to process alone. Steve turned back to Marcus, his expression showing the profound respect he felt for this man's struggle. Marcus, you've been fighting this war by yourself for 6 years. But wars aren't meant to be fought alone. Heroes need support, guidance, and people who understand what they've been through. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. This has my phone number on it, he said, handing it to Marcus. Not my agents, not my managers, mine, and I want you to call me this week, because I'm going to connect you with people who specialize in helping warriors transition home. But Steve wasn't finished. He addressed the cameras directly. I want everyone watching this to understand something, he said. Freedom isn't free, and sometimes the cost is paid not just by those who serve, but by their families who love them through the aftermath. Marcus Johnson and families like his need our support, our understanding, and our commitment to ensuring that those who serve our country get the help they need when they come home. The audience response was immediate and overwhelming. The standing ovation wasn't the typical game show applause. It was recognition of sacrifice, acknowledgement of pain, and commitment to support. Marcus, overwhelmed by the acceptance and understanding he had never dared to hope for, broke down completely. Sarah immediately moved to support her husband, and their children, who had been watching with wide eyes, surrounded their father with the kind of unconditional love that families provide when they understand that healing is a journey, not a destination. The episode that aired 2 weeks later became one of the most watched and most discussed in Family Feud history. Not because of the game, but because viewers witnessed something powerful, a veteran's courage in sharing his truth, and a community's response in offering support rather than judgment. But the real story happened after the cameras stopped rolling. True to his word, Steve connected Marcus with the best PTSD treatment specialists in the country. Through Steve's foundation, Marcus was enrolled in an intensive therapy program that specialized in helping combat veterans process trauma and develop healthy coping mechanisms. The treatment wasn't easy or quick. Marcus had to confront memories and emotions he'd been suppressing for years. He had to learn that seeking help wasn't weakness, but wisdom, that healing wasn't betrayal of his fallen comrades, but honor for their sacrifice. Sarah and the children participated in family therapy, learning how to support Marcus while also caring for their own needs. They discovered that PTSD affects entire families, not just the person who experienced the trauma, and that healing happens best when everyone is involved in the process. Steve maintained regular contact with the family throughout Marcus's treatment, checking on his progress and providing encouragement during the most difficult phases of therapy. He arranged for Marcus to connect with other veterans who had successfully navigated similar journeys, creating a support network of people who understood his experience. 6 months after that Family Feud taping, Marcus Johnson was a different man. Not because he had returned to who he was before the war. That person was gone forever. But because he had learned to integrate his experiences, to honor his service while also caring for his mental health, to be both a warrior and a father, a protector and a man who needed protection himself. Marcus began speaking at veterans events about his experience with PTSD and treatment. His message was always the same. Seeking help isn't giving up. It's gearing up for the next mission, the mission of being present for your family, of contributing to your community, of living a life worthy of those who didn't make it home. Steve established the Marcus Johnson Veterans Mental Health Initiative, providing funding for PTSD treatment and family support services for veterans who couldn't afford care. The initiative has helped hundreds of veterans access treatment and has trained thousands of family members in supporting their loved ones through the healing process. 2 years after that episode aired, Marcus Johnson received his degree in social work and began working as a counselor specializing in veteran mental health. He uses his own experience with PTSD to help other veterans understand that recovery is possible, that they're not alone, and that asking for help is one of the bravest things a person can do. The Johnson family is stronger now than they were before Marcus deployed. Not because the war didn't change them, but because they learned to grow through the change together. Emma and Tyler, now old enough to understand more about their father's service, are proud not just of his military heroism, but of his courage in fighting for his mental health. Steve Harvey learned something that day that changed how he approaches every show, every interaction with veterans, every moment he spends in the public eye. He learned that coming home from war isn't an event, it's a process, and that sometimes the most important battle veterans fight is the one for their own peace of mind. Marcus's story became more than just a television moment. It became a catalyst for conversations about veteran mental health, about the importance of seeking help, and about the responsibility all Americans have to support those who served. Because sometimes a veteran's honest confession about invisible wounds can teach an entire studio about the true cost of freedom. Sometimes a game show can become a platform for healing. And sometimes the most powerful television happens when someone decides that a warrior's pain matters more than any script, any ratings consideration, any show business protocol. Marcus's truth, that he came back from war, but his soul stayed there, became a rallying cry for veteran mental health awareness and a reminder that healing is possible when warriors are willing to lay down their arms long enough to accept help, support, and love. Today, when Marcus Johnson wakes up, he still carries the memories of war, but he also carries the tools to process those memories, the support of a family that understands his journey, and the knowledge that his struggles have helped other veterans find their way home to themselves. And that may be the most heroic thing of all.